invite you to go with me. What book do you think we might turn to this morning? No, it's not the Maccabees. We are turning to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes. So grab your device, your Bibles, go to Ecclesiastes. We're going to be kind of almost verse by verse. I don't plan to do that for all 12 chapters, but I will do it. I did it a bit last week. We'll do it this week. Next time we get together, probably it'll be chapter 4. So we'll be looking at chapter 4. And so Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you have that, I have a question for you. How many here are wearing a watch? If you're wearing a watch, would you lift the hand that the watch is on? Go ahead. Okay, I was wondering how many. About half. Just about half. I know if I were to ask that 20 years ago, it would almost be everybody, but it's just not as common. I mean, we have our phones, we have things, we don't. Okay, of those who lifted your arm with the watch on, how many you really do depend on that watch? You really do depend on it. Okay, about half of them. But I would lift mine. It's crazy. I wish I didn't depend so much on my watch, but I'm fairly watch conscious of the time. You're thinking, well, how come that's not true on Sunday morning? Well, Sunday morning's the exception. Not so conscious of my time on Sunday morning, but anyway, that's a whole other story. Time. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about time. Time for everything. Time. And you can grab these. These are notes, and so we'll just let those sit there for a moment. You can grab that on your phone. We have time to do that. And so we're going to grab this, and we are going to talk. We're just going to let that sit up there for a minute. When you think about time, time is woven into every fabric of the day. Think about these phrases. I just began to jot them down. It's just boom, 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 boom. I've already used one. What time does the meeting start? I don't have time right now. How much time is it going to take? Oh, don't waste your time on that. Oh, it's time to go. Time out. It's time we had a long talk. Boy, you don't like hearing that one. What time is dinner? Take out a clean sheet of paper. It's time for a pop quiz. Even yet I shake when I hear that. It's time for a pop quiz. Time. Definition: a stretch of duration in which things happen. Time is significant because it is so rare. Time is totally, absolutely, completely irretrievable. The moment I began to talk about time, I'll never have that moment again. It's gone. Forever. Now, yeah, I know you say you've got a smart TV and you're hooked to the internet and you can hit replay. But that's different because you're simply recalling an old event. It's already done. It can't be changed. Have you ever noticed how the same amount of time can be so different? Let me give you an illustration. Let's say you decide to go on a diet for 2 weeks. Compare that to your 2-week vacation. Now, your 2-week vacation, same amount of time, but the 2-week vacation went like that, and the diet never ended. Same amount of time, but the time appears different. That's time. Time is fascinating in many ways. We are looking through the book of Ecclesiastes in pursuit of happiness. Now, I trust, well, we all want to be happy. I want to be happy. I can guarantee you do too. Whether you feel or don't feel deserving of happiness is maybe a whole other topic. We want to be happy. And Solomon, in the pursuit of happiness, this is one of the last books, it is the last book that he writes in our canon, and he is later in life, he's a little messed up. You will get good moments and you get moments that aren't very wise. I'm going to be mentioning it later, but there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. Okay? There's a difference between intelligence. You can be intelligent, but not wise. And there's a difference between wisdom and spiritual wisdom. The things of this world, the wise things of this world are not wise in the kingdom of heaven. Things of the kingdom of heaven, this world does not consider, they consider it foolishness. The Bible talks about that. So there's a difference between intellect and wisdom, and a difference between wisdom and spiritual wisdom. Now, actually, that last component, when I'm done this series, I actually want to talk about that. I'm going to spend a few weeks, and we're going to be talking about the difference between wisdom and spiritual wisdom. But that's down the road. Today we're talking in the bracket of dealing with the pursuit of happiness, trying to understand some things, and this is where Solomon is, because he is a very intelligent person. But he is misinterpreting some things in his life. As we talked in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he keeps saying that this is pointless, this is empty, everything under the sun is empty, meaningless. He says, empty, empty, empty. And we came to a conclusion. One of them was, get your eyes up then. If what is visible doesn't satisfy, then you need to recognize there's something invisible that will. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we move into chapter 3. So are you there? Chapter 3. Actually, before we start chapter 3, maybe I'll just, because they don't break this down in the original writings, and so we're going to flow from the end of chapter 2 into chapter 3. So Ecclesiastes 2, verse 24, we finished with this last week. A man can do nothing better than to eat, drink, and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, God, who can eat or find enjoyment? Then he flows chapter 3, what we have is chapter 3. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. Then Solomon moves into 14 contrasts. You've heard them. You've probably heard them at funerals. I've got a funeral message with this passage of Scripture. Most pastors, most who talk at funerals will include a portion of this. He names 14 contrasts. Here they are. There's a time to give birth and a time to die. His point, you can't hasten either. There's a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. You don't have to be a farmer here to know there's a season to put the seed in the ground, and there's a season to take what's grown out of the ground. We know this is true on a personal level. There's a time to put down your roots in something, and there's a time to move on. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. You've watched on news feeds cold-blooded murderers taking someone's life. But the very next story could be a miracle drug that saves a life. Taking, saving. There's a time to tear down and a time to build up. I think a picture of this is urban sprawl. I also think a time to tear down, a time to build up. I was thinking, I grew up on a century-old farm in our name for over 100 years. And my great-grandpa built the house on the homestead. My grandpa doubled it, built another portion to the house. And my great-grandpa, well, all my great-grandpas, my grandma's children were born there. My grandpa and his siblings were all born in the house. My dad and my father's siblings were all born in that house. And when we sold the property back in 1992, the Mennonites who bought it lived in it for about 10 years, and then they came to us. We remain friends, even to this day, we remain friends. And they will have it prayerfully for generations. They're a God-fearing family. And they came to us and they said, we're going to break bad news to you. We're planning to tear down the house and build a new one. And we just said, go for it. Go. You know, the house served its purpose. It served its purpose. What we did do is we took some bricks, all the siblings, my siblings, we took some bricks from the house, and we'll keep that for whatever, until our grandkids who know nothing about the property will throw them out and wonder why they got a bunch of bricks hanging around. But my kids are really excited. They said, Dad, you got to keep some bricks. And so my kids remember the place, but my grandkids, they won't care. But there was a time for it, and there was a time to tear it down. The new house looked great. They wanted to take us through, but I just didn't. I don't know. It's not going to be like the old house, right? It looks gorgeous, and the old house it was falling down in many ways. The point: time to tear down, a time to build up. Solomon says, a time to weep and a time to laugh. Weeping usually comes in low tides of life, where you feel unfruitful, perhaps unloved, even towards spiritual things, maybe towards God even. And we can grow cynical. We're going to talk about that because this is an issue that Solomon, it's really the issue of Ecclesiastes, of him in his later life. He had become cynical. He had become cynical. I heard about a pastor who left the pastorate after pastoring 20 years. He decided to become a funeral director. Somebody asked, well, why did you do that? Well, he answered, he said, well, I spent 20 years trying to straighten out Jack. He never did get straightened out. 14 months trying to straighten out the marriage of the Smiths, and it never did get straightened out. I spent 3 years trying to straighten out Susan, and she never did get straightened out. So now, when I straighten them out, they stay straight. True. There's a time to weep, a time to laugh. A time to mourn, a time to dance. A time to throw stones, a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. Actually, if you take number 7 and number 8, they can be linked together. There's a time for affirmation and there's a time for confrontation. That's what he's saying. There are occasions when a friend of ours needs to come, throw their arms around you, pull you close to them and say, it's going to be okay, and you feel their courage come into you. And then there are times with that same friend where they need to stand in front of you, take you by your shoulders, look into your eyes, and with a strong voice disagree with you because they love you. There's a time for both. He goes on, number 9, a time to search and a time to give up as lost. Rescue squads continually face this dilemma. Rescue or retrieve, rescue or retrieve. Number 10, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Kind of makes you think of your closet, doesn't it? Listen, if the clothes haven't fit you for the last 2 years, okay, give it to Cuba. Guys, in the garage, if you haven't used it in a long time, I'm just saying, there's a time to keep, a time to throw away. We are, by nature, most of us hoarders. Okay, number 11, a time to tear apart, a time to sew together, a time to be silent, a time to speak. The older I grow in life, the more I realize listening is an art. And wise people need to listen more. And again, this is where I believe there's a difference between intelligent people and wise people. Wise learn how to first listen. Number 13, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And if you're a peacemaker, you know that keeping the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace is paramount. And so I guess the question is, are you a person who loves to stir up conflict, or are you a person of peace? Are you a person who silences rumors when they get to you, they stop at you? Or are you the person who likes to pass the rumor on? A time for war, a time for peace. So Solomon comes to a conclusion, verse 10. I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Let me do that again. By the way, I invite you to mark a portion of this, especially verse 11. I'm going to go back to verse 10. I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. Now, verse 11. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Here's the part. He has also set eternity in the human heart. There's a phrase it's worth you coming back to regularly. He has set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Eternity. I'm going to pause here for a second. a curiosity about our future. We're unique in all the species. We have eternity in our heart. And it's because God created us after his likeness and his image. He has created us. He gave us spirit and soul. And our spirit has a connection with eternity. It's eternal. And God has, and Solomon makes this comment, he has set eternity in the human heart. God has put a timetable into perspective. He's put in you a probe. It's eternal. The probe is looking ahead. The probe is wanting to know what's down the road. That's unique. He's put eternity in our heart. Because, church, listen this morning, we really aren't ready to handle life until we're ready to face death. When we come to grips at the end of life and eternity, then back up the rest of life, it makes sense. What I do today, I do because of that. What I do in the next year, my plans in life, my career, my family, my relationships, my mission is based on eternity. It's the future, the probe. Thus, if we've aspired for evolution, we are just, a blob growing up, then we don't have eternity. We doesn't make sense because there's no eternity. We just die and that's the end of all things. We're in an evolutionary process. But what Solomon is making mention of, he's placed eternity in our heart. He's put a probe for the future. That's in our heart. When we look at that, when we understand that God has made all things according to his glory, there is eternal life in God. Not everybody will go to heaven, but those who are children of God, when he's placed that when we realize that in our heart, then out of that we now have purpose for everything since. What I do today makes sense. What you're doing right now makes sense. What you're going to do tomorrow makes sense if you've got that on your heart. But if that's not there, then you live for the moment. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's so incomplete. Because the end is not death. The end is not death. This is one of the biggest things. If that's all we got this morning from this, we had enough to go home and chew on it for a while. Really. If we could be like the old cows on the farm, we could spit it back up from our second stomach and start chewing the cud again. It's got a lot of chewables to it. Eternity. And if we don't have that in our hearts, then this bobbles. Thus, it explains our Canadian society. It explains a lot of stuff going on in the world. So he makes this powerful. That's why mark it in your Bibles and never forget it and always remember it and go back to it. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also programmed eternity in the human heart. Okay. Let's continue. God has given us an eternal itch for tomorrow. He's given us a hunger to know what's next. That's unique in the human heart. And that's why we can find hope, or you can be lost with no hope. God has given us the ability to see beyond the present and work towards that end. Let's continue, verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. So let's talk about that. God has given, and I began to count in those 2 verses, 4 gifts. Read it again. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. Number 1, God gives us the ability to rejoice and enjoy life. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live. Rejoice and enjoy life. The believer is the one who understands and enjoys this gift because we've come to understand that this is a gift that God gives. And when we get that perspective, that God is the giver of all good gifts, He's the sustainer of life, and in life, joy, regardless of what you go through today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Regardless. God has given you a gift, and He has given you the ability to rejoice in that gift. Again, it's perspective. Let me use an illustration. It's a story I read of a man who fretted over his business. He hassled over it for years. He had many a night, restless night, with business problems, propositions, plans, shortcomings. For 2 decades he fought with this, and one day he decided he was in church. He was at wit's end. And the pastor that Sunday was talking about the value of turning everything over to God. Everything personally, everything relationally, and everything that you work for, over to God. And it resonated with this man. And so he decided that day that he would turn his entire business. God, it's yours. Now, he wanted God's blessing on it prior to that, but today, that day, he made a decision, God, it's your business. He testifies, he said, he just felt the weight come off of him. It's God's business. Doesn't mean he wasn't going to work, doesn't mean he wasn't going to be diligent, but he wasn't going to fret. God's business, it's yours, Lord. He drove away worry-free. By the time he got home, he had totally and unequivocally committed his business to God. That night, while he was deep in sleep, he was awakened with an emergency call. His business was on fire. He rather calmly drove down to the commercial residence and was standing on the street watching his business go up in flames. And he had a grin. One of his colleagues raced to his side and questioned if he was okay. And he replied, he says, I know it's burning, but that's okay. Yesterday morning, I gave this company to God. And if He wants to burn it up, that's His business. You see the perspective? If He wants to burn it up, it's His business. Because it's His. A fire couldn't take away His gift. It's a gift. That's what Solomon said. It's a gift of rejoicing. He can rejoice in the good and He can rejoice when it's not so good. Secondly, God gives us the ability to do good in our lifetime. Listen to this one. Beloved, don't put off serving others for the big opportunity that likely will never come. Serve others today. Just start serving. There are those who I'm early in my career, I don't have time. I'm early raising a family, I don't have time. I'm early doing this, early doing that, blah, 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 blah. I'm sure that's how God sees it. Blah, 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 blah. You know, no, right where you are today, what you're going through, the people, the associations you have, start serving. Start serving. Just look where there's a need and start helping. Just serve. That's what he's saying. He gives us, it's a gift, the ability to do good in our lifetime. If you say tomorrow, it'll always remain a tomorrow. So, rereading Ecclesiastes 3:13, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. Point number 3. Gift number 3, God gives us an appetite to eat and drink. The ability to enjoy food. How many here enjoy food? Oh, come on, all of you do. All of you do. We enjoy food. Some of us maybe more than others. We enjoy food. And we enjoy food like a good night's sleep. You enjoy a good night's sleep? Man, you can't buy it. It's a gift. It's a gift from God. Fourth gift, God gives us the ability to see good in all our labor. Good in all our labor and all that you do, that you can see good in it. I'm going to call this perspective. Perspective. Gift of perspective. We all have it. We all go through stuff, are living in stuff. But what we do with the stuff of our life has to do with your perspective. I was thinking about this past week, and my son came to my mind. Jonas, our son who lives down in Florida, and when he was in his mid-teens, he was pulling away from the things we had trained in home. He had become angry. He started getting into, he's very musical. Both our children are very musical. But he started getting into music that was very dark and very evil. And it was changing his perspective in life. He was such a carefree, go-lucky, happy kid, the life of the party, until that period of his life. And then he entered, and then he became, huge conflicts began to happen. He began to disrespect us. He entered into a relationship with a girl who her perspective in life was she was extreme critical. She was out with her parents. She didn't like me, didn't like any of the pastors at the church. She'd grown up in the church, didn't like any of us. And she was cynical about everything, and they became an item. And they were an item for some time, and that deepened his anger towards everything that he had been trained in. He got into drugs. He was angry at the world and was very influenced in another direction. In so much that in his later teen years, he just said, I had enough. Can't have two alpha males in the house, me and him. And one of the males had to leave, and he did. He left. It wasn't going to be me. So he left. And then he wandered the streets for a while. We didn't know where he was. He came across God's providence, had him come across an old friend, an old childhood friend that he knew from kindergarten, who was in another city and was involved in a church. And so Jonas connected with him, was sleeping on his couch when he could, and other times he was sleeping outside. And in that period of time, he started to be connected as his late teens, picking up odds and sods jobs, living in a rat-infested house, all in all stuff going on. And then he began the journey back, and it was an incredible story. He met Erica during this time and became engaged. Erica's our daughter-in-law now. And Eric is now the worship pastor at a church down in Punta Gorda, Florida. She's the worship pastor. My son Jonas is the band leader. He leads the band and the music. He continues to play keys, and he organizes the music for them. He's written songs. He was back in the day, he was into spoken words. And so I came across it. When I looked at perspective, I thought, my son did a spoken word called Perspective years ago. So I looked it up on YouTube, found it was on YouTube, and I got a hold of my son, and I said, Jonas, when did you do this? And he said, it was 2012, Dad. He said, Eric and I he thinks they were just engaged at the time. Anybody want to watch it? It's about 5 minutes. So in this percent, we're going to throw it up here for you to watch. My son and now our daughter-in-law, they're engaged at the time, it's 2012, and he wrote this Perspective. It was about, he was all twisted off, and his perspective had gotten off, and it was this pursuit of coming back. And he's standing in front of a mirror in this production here. He's in front of a mirror, and he's angry. You hear it coming out. On the other side of the mirror is Erica. She's representing God, saying, but I was always there. When you couldn't see me, when you didn't know I was always there. As he's talking into this mirror, and you have this going back and forth, and then they come together as the band. They were part of a band at the church. And so, anyway, let's do that. Let's watch this.
As I open my eyes, I see a reflection of imperfection. All my faults, my past right there in front of me. How could you ever use me?
I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper, not to harm you.
I feel like I'm at a loss. Every night I turn and I toss with thoughts that plague me. I'm no one important at all. Look at me, trust me, I'm just me.
Fearfully and wonderfully made to be like me, so try to see what I see.
I'm getting sick of this. Every mistake that I make with this guilt that is building. My flesh is unyielding, my spirit is breaking in this defeat that I'm facing.
Neither height nor depth, mistake or sin can separate you from my love within.
I wanna feel alive again. I feel it's been a while since I've been on your mind. To sing a severed all communication and aching from within. It's the consequence I'm facing.
Leave you or forsake you. Trust in me, and you will see what
Enough is enough. It's tough being called a hypocrite and such. A Christian with no guts. The world has a magnifying glass on us. Our image is tarnished. They don't trust us.
By your love, I have overcome the world. So don't give up.
I'm ready to throw in the towel. This is an uphill battle. This is a matter of futility. As far as I see, I'll put it simply, the spiritually dying around me.
I will pour out my spirit in the last days. Look to me.
I want to see what you see. Lord, open my eyes. It's time I realize I gave in to the lies. My insights compromised. But now I'm fed up. It's time to say enough. Because something I've seen has been so deceptive. Not anymore, Lord, break my perspective. Open my eyes and break my perspective. I was fearfully and wonderfully made just to see what you see. You'll never leave me or forsake me. I trust in you. Give me vision just to see the things you do. My flesh rises up and my spirit is weak, but you are my strength, all that I need. I lay down my life, all my demands, to see for your rise, to change who I am. No longer my will, but yours alone. Created for so much more. Created to create.
Interesting, isn't it? That was, very much we can track back 13 years into this part of his journey as he gained perspective. And here's the gift. That's the point we're making in this portion right here. God gives us the ability to see good in all our labor. So we go down to verse 14. Solomon says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before. And God will call the past to account. Just quickly, some of the qualities of God's work. That's what Solomon, he's looking at the quality. He's now gaining a God perspective. Some of the qualities of God's work. He says, first of all, it's permanent. Note the part where it says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. He acknowledges that. He sees it. Will endure forever. There's permanence. Whatever God does is permanent. God does nothing shallow, nothing superficial. He continues on that another quality of God's work is it's thorough and it's complete. Nothing can be added to God's work. Nothing can be taken away. It's never too little. It's never too late. It's never too much. Never too early. There's never anything missing. It's thorough. It's complete. Thirdly, he acknowledges the quality of God's work, that God performs things that cultivate respect for him because he alone is awesome. And you just have to look. I mean, it's wonderful to see cities and skyscrapers and stuff, but is there anything ever like going into the mountains, looking upon the meadows, a forest, the ocean rushing up on land? Is there anything that can ever match that? God is awesome in all. He alone is awesome. What God does makes us stand back and respect. There's a divine being behind that. It puts our human achievements really so much lower. So we look again back to verse 15. Whatever is has already been. What will be has been before. And God will call the past to account. The fourth thing regarding the quality is God patiently repeats things until we learn them. God is patient. You ever notice that? He brings us around again to relearn a lesson we didn't get the first time. And when we continue to fight him, he'll bring us around again to see if we've learned what he's trying to show us. We get weary of learning the lesson. We get weary from running from it. He repeats the same lesson. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. We tend to run, but God will bring us around. He'll take me around that mountain one more borrowing time. And then down to verse 16. Number of verses we're going to read here. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked. For there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. There he's back to that core theme. Verse 20. All go to the same place, all come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? I want to just draw attention to how many times he repeatedly says in those verses, I saw, or I said to myself. He's talking to himself. He is simply having a self-conversation. He's talking about what he is doing. He, him. Everything's around that. Instead of him on his knees asking God to reveal himself, he's on his feet, talking and talking. You don't find him looking up. You find him simply looking around at the things he sees. His perspective is down. You won't find Solomon quietly seeking patience in prayer. He's rather shouting at God. This is aggressive. He's angry. What's the point, God? Verse 16 actually gives us some insight into the problem that caused Solomon to fall into the cynical slump, because that's the slump he is in. It's where he says, I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. It sounds familiar. Wickedness wins over justice. Wickedness wins over justice. Wickedness wins. What's the point? He's angry. So is there a solution to cynicism? If you look back through those verses 17 to 21, there are some solutions. I'm going to point out some. Solution number one. He does mention this, but in passing, as he tries to figure this out. Solution one, injustice will have only a temporary reign. Solomon has a rare moment where he says, for a time, for every matter and every deed, relief will eventually come. Wrong doesn't last forever. Delayed judgment by God does not mean dismissed judgment. He will still exercise justice. What you see today is not what's going to happen later. So wrong will not last forever. It's going to one day be judged under the sovereign hand of a just God, all of it. Solution two is injustice reveals our carnal behavior. Solomon says that the beasts of the field today that die and drop into a hole, turn back into dust, has no future, is exactly like you and me, exactly like us humans. We die, we drop into a hole, we turn back into a dust, and that's it. There's no advantage. And Note the question he asks in verse 21. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes downward? Beloved, this morning Solomon has unwisely stated heresy here. Cynics are mentally confused. He's cynical. When we do not deal with the cynical spirit, we too become confused. Anger draws us into an emotional confusion. It numbs us spiritually. Cynicism leaves us with scars, bitterness, disillusionment, and we feel distant from God in cynicism. Like I shared about my son's story, that journey away. And that's the byproduct. And this is where Solomon, he makes this statement in verse 21, a rash heresy. Some of Solomon's concluding remarks in verse 22, he says, so I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? So leaving verse 21 as a question mark hanging in all our minds, okay, verse 21, who knows? Who knows, he says, verse 21. It's a question mark in all our minds. Solomon comes back with a solution as his conclusion. Here's his solution. Now, does he say, try to understand your circumstance? No. Does he say, compare your lot with another person and see how much better yours is than theirs? No. Does he say, retaliate? Resent? Become bitter? You didn't get a fair shake? No, he doesn't say that. Does he say, move to some lonely spot, grind out your twilight years in resentful silence? Nope, doesn't say that. Does he say, go into a fantasy world, build a dream, live in your dream, work her, but live there, and you can make it if you just live in your own fantasy world? No. What he does actually say, if you break and pare it down, he says, reject self-pity, reject taking vengeance into your hands, reject resentment, and reject retaliation. You got to reject that in the middle of this. And find ways to discover advantages to your disadvantages. We're going to stop here. This is big, okay? Find ways to discover advantages to your disadvantages. Verse 22, the first part again. So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. We usually can do very little to change our lot, but we can change our heart. Okay, you need to pick this up. We can change our attitude. God can replace a heart of stone with a new heart. And some of you here could testify to that, where your heart was hard and angry and bitter, and he's replaced it. Your heart's different. You're a different person. Go back to the beginning of verse 22. So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. The last part. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? Now, I'd like to think Solomon is asking, who knows the impact it will have on others? I'd like to think he's asking, who will bring us to see what will occur after such a positive attitude response? I'm not sure if he's asking that, though, when he says, for who can bring them to see what will happen after them? But I'd like to believe that. So here's the conclusion. It's 3 questions. It's our questions. First of all, what is your unfair disadvantage? And this is not a rhetorical question. This actually is a question this morning. What is your unjust disadvantage? I want you to think about this, everyone here. I don't mean little petty irritations, the car sputtered and didn't start the way I wanted it to this morning. That's a petty one. I'm talking about major unjust disadvantages in your life. I want you to think about it. Maybe you were born in a family that didn't love you. Maybe you were put up for adoption. Maybe your parent left through whatever circumstance. Maybe you felt unloved. You were unloved. Okay? Maybe you did not have the physical appearance. You've been at a disadvantage all your life. And you feel you would have had a lot better opportunities if you didn't look like you do right now, whatever your looks were. Maybe it's your intelligence. Maybe it's your ability or lack of ability. You can't communicate. Maybe you have a disposition. Maybe it's poor. You have never had anything. Maybe you've got a sickness. Maybe you struggle with a mental illness, a chemical imbalance. You struggle with a physical right from get-go. So I will ask the question again, because this is not a rhetorical question. This is a question I want you to, you're not going to tell me what it is. I want you to come up with your answer. What is your, if you were to pick pick one, what is your unjust disadvantage? I'm just going to give you a moment. What's yours? What's yours been? What's your unjust? What's been done? I want you to think about it. What's your unjust disadvantage? And now you got your answer. So here's the question. When do you plan to replace passive self-pity with active courage? Now maybe you've already begun the journey or they're on the journey. What I'm asking for is to take a different belief regarding the suffering you're enduring. Get a hold of God's plan for you. God's plan. Because whatever your unfair, unjust disadvantage is, the devil has been lying to you about it. God has something you need to hear about it. He didn't remove it because he's asking you for something else. And remember, when God asks you for something else, it's always the best plan. It's never a plan B. Never is it a plan B with God. Solomon already acknowledged everything he does is perfect. So what appears to be out of sorts with you, what appears to be wrong, unfair, look at the dirt you've had to endure, and then you wallow in this. And this is where Solomon is struggling with this, is he's seeing people doing it. But again, he's got to get his eyes up higher and see God in the situation. So the question comes back, when do you plan to replace a passive self-pity with active courage? Which brings me to my last one. Have you ever considered the impact your distinctive message would have on the world around you if you truly bring God into it? Take your disadvantage that you thought of. I guarantee there's other people with those disadvantages. You get God's perspective. Get that eternity going on in the heart that you know the end to the beginning. And begin to reach out and bless them. Because God has taken you to where you are. I talked about this in Life Together groups. It's called shape. He has shaped us in a certain way, in a certain environment, from whatever your background, whatever your disadvantages, and we all have them. We all have them. We all have them. Some of them are huge, and some of them are horrible disadvantages. But they will not overwhelm you if you invite God to turn it for his glory. And instead of wallowing in it and saying, woe am I just been, it just really stinks to be me. And then realize, God, you've wonderfully made me. And that last question as I head here, what impact can I have on my world if I get a God perspective? I guarantee you, because I've seen this over and over and again, it'll transform people's lives and yours. It'll transform people's lives. Perhaps you were a child and struggled with insecurities. You'll be amazed at how many insecure people God's going to put around you now. Perhaps you felt you were always horribly ugly. I don't know what I'm going to say there. There's a whole bunch of ugly people around you right now. I don't know. But there's people that struggle with their self-image. And you can do something about it. You can help them in a God perspective. You are there for them. So here today, before we break out, what is your story? We're going to learn from Solomon here. We're going to learn. What's your story? All of us have a story. All of our stories have an injustice to them. You think it's the thing that has caused you to become a failure, but it's not true. That's the lie. As God reveals himself to you, that's where the battle is won. as you embrace it, you turn the disadvantage not into something that has disqualified you, but now you become significantly used by God because you refuse to allow that disadvantage to turn you into a cynic like Solomon had become. You refuse. You're not going to do it. I believe that's why Ecclesiastes is there for us. It's to learn from him. You don't have to go that way. There's a better way. There's a better way. I'm going to invite Pastor Daniel to come. So we're going to close right there. We're going to close right there. What was your unfair disadvantage? Is it still holding you back in some regard? You're still blaming it. We're not talking about, well, I've reason to blame it. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about God's going to lift you out of that right now, because that might not be the best thing. What we are saying is if you invite Holy Spirit into that and believe him and look for him. And by the way, you can look for him. If you want to get a new perspective, slowly read and study the book of Ephesians. It's a group of people who were secular who began to get a new perspective of who they were. Begin to slowly read the book of Ephesians. You'll begin to see something about yourself. Begin to read through the beloved John's writings in the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd. Begin to read through his writings, and you begin to see a person who became the one who was least among the disciples, who felt he was the most loved of Jesus. Perspective. His perspective changed. God changed him. And he does that for us. So today, I invite you, I really think this is a strategic moment for some of us here today, that we invite Holy Spirit, like that businessman I gave illustration. We were saying, God, this is yours, I'm yours. And God changed my perspective. I'm going to renew my mind in you. The old is past, it's gone. I can't change any of it. But I can change my purpose for today and then tomorrow and then for my life. I can change it. Because God, you are in my life now. And we're going to invite him to do that.